Are Donald Trump's trade tariffs biblical? As Christians, can we justify them? Can we support them? It's a really huge issue at the moment, isn't it? Because as I film this, the trade tariffs against China have been announced. Tariffs against Mexico and Canada have been postponed for 30 days. But there's also tariffs threatened against the EU, possibly against India and against the UK as well. So wherever you live in the world, we are all going to be impacted by a potential tariff war. Can they be justified? That's what we're thinking about today, and I'm sorry if I sound a bit croaky. I've not been very well for the last couple of days, and this is my first time out, so apologies if my voice is a little croaky. Now, I have to start off by saying I'm not an economist, and so I really can't speak into this issue from an economic perspective. I've read the arguments. It seems to me there's some arguments that are in favour of tariffs, there's some arguments that are against it, but that's not really my area of expertise. But I am a theologian, and what I want to do today is to come at this from a theological perspective and ask the question whether or not these are something that can be supported from a Christian perspective. Now, you're going to need to bear with me in this video, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an argument built up over various layers. So I'm not going to come out at the beginning and say, yes, we can justify it, or no, we can't. I want to develop a theological argument. So bear with me, follow the argument through, and by the end, hopefully you'll have enough information to be able to assess for yourself whether you think trade tariffs are justifiable or not. Now, there is no silver bullet text in Scripture that we can turn to that will give us an answer to this issue. At no point does God say in the Bible, thou shalt use trade tariffs. At no point in the Bible does God say, thou shalt not use trade tariffs. So we can't really point to any one particular verse in Scripture or a range of verses that will give us the answer we're looking for. Jesus does mention trade tariffs apart from taxes. He mentions them as a separate thing in Matthew chapter 17 verse 25. So tariffs are mentioned there. If we read the book of Ezra in the Old Testament, chapter 4 verse 13, tariffs are mentioned there as well, in a letter to King Artaxerxes, where there's a threat to the king that if he continues with a particular course of action, then the people won't pay the tariffs. And conversely, in Deuteronomy chapter 2 verses 2 to 7, there seems to be an argument in favour of free trade, so not using tariffs. So, you know, there's various verses that mention them, but, you know, we would be very, very foolish to try to develop an economic argument for the 21st century based on a few random and rather ambiguous texts of Scripture. So we need to take a deeper approach. We need to take an altogether different approach. So this is where I'm going to layer the argument up so that hopefully you can come to your own perspective on it. And there's two principles I want to think about. And the first is this, that whether or not tariffs are legitimate in an economic society is firstly to do with how we create and protect culture. Now, the very first command of God to human beings was to create and protect culture. Now, I didn't say commandment, the very first commandment, as in the Ten Commandments, but go back further than that. The very first command that God gave to human beings was to create and protect culture. In Genesis chapter 1 verse 28, it says this, have many children so that your descendants will live over all the earth and bring it under their control. Now, that is a reference to the creation of culture and the protection of culture. Now, what is culture? Well, culture is basically how we order and structure society. Probably the best definition of culture that I've ever come across is simply this. It's how we do things around here. It's the way we do things around here. How do we structure society? How do we create order in society? And how do we use society for the good of humanity and the blessing of all people? That was the very first command that God gave to human beings. So fundamentally, we are to relate to one another in such a way that structure comes into society, people are protected, and that the way we live together will enhance and benefit humanity. Now, how do we go about that? How do we do that? Well, I think we find the answer in part in Genesis chapter 4, verses 20 to 22, because in this passage, the descendants of Cain are listed, and there's three in particular who are of particular interest. The first is Jabal. And Jabal is defined as the ancestor of those who raise livestock. And then we have Jubal, and Jubal is designated the ancestor of musicians. And then we have Tubal-Cain, and Tubal-Cain is the ancestor of those who created tools. Now, it seems to me that in Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain, we have represented the three ways in which culture is created: production, arts, and technology. Production, Jabal, who raised livestock; Jubal, ancestor of musicians, arts; and Tubal-Cain, the ancestor of toolmakers, technology. So we create structure and order in society. We create culture through means of production, through arts, and through technology. Now, it seems to me then that if we are going to fulfill that command of God, and if we're going to think about whether or not tariffs are a legitimate economic tool, then it really comes down to how we view culture. Let me explain. If you think that the culture you live in, or the culture that you need to build and protect, is predominantly local, i.e. the area in which you live, and it's predominantly independent, i.e. not dependent on other cultures, then you could argue that tariffs, the use of tariffs, is legitimate. Because what you're doing is you're saying, look, God has given me this culture in which to live, this area, this geographic area with these people, and it is my God-given duty to defend and build and strengthen this culture. And if other cultures are threatening my culture, then I can use tariffs in order to defend it and build it. However, if you believe that all cultures are actually interconnected and that we live in a global culture, then that is going to impact how you view tariffs, because you're going to see that actually by introducing tariffs, you're going to harm other cultures and potentially harm your own culture as well. So how do you view culture? Do you see it as something local, or do you see it as something global? When God has given us this mandate, this cultural mandate to create and strengthen culture, was he talking locally, or was he talking globally? Let me know, because this is such a fascinating theological topic for us to be wrestling with today. I don't just want to give you my views on this. I really want us to have a good theological conversation about this. So please do leave me your views in the comments below, and let's spark a conversation about this. A good Christian and theological response to the question of tariffs. So the first thing then is the creation of culture. The second second theological principle that I think we need to think about is the call on us as Christians to show compassion on our neighbour. Now, this is, of course, at the very, very heart of the gospel, isn't it? We know that love is the underpinning principle of God's kingdom. We know that showing compassion and grace and mercy to our neighbour, is at the very heart of the Christian faith. Love your neighbour as you love yourself. Now, when it comes to economic tariffs, there are, of course, both winners and losers. And it's not just people overseas who are the losers. If Donald Trump has introduced tariffs against China, it's not just people in China who will lose, potentially, but also people in the United States as well. Remember how tariffs work. It's not the Chinese government doesn't pay 10% tariff on their products. It's the person importing the product into the US who pays the 10% tariff. And so it's a disincentive for a US citizen to trade overseas. That's the idea behind it. So if you're a car manufacturer and you need, if you need rubber tires, and you're based in the US, you might import your rubber tires from China. But now the price of those has gone up 10%. So the idea there is that you will source your tires locally rather than buying them from China. So, now that may be, it will certainly hurt China. But it may also hurt the local US businessman as well, because it might mean that they can't source their product locally, or they're going to have to raise prices or potentially close their business down. So there are winners and losers, because the winners in that situation might be US tyre manufacturers, but the losers might be the US companies that have previously imported and can't afford to pay US prices. And the losers certainly would be the Chinese tyre manufacturers. So there's winners and losers, and the losers can be local as well as overseas. And so in a situation where there are winners and losers, we are left with a really fundamental theological question, which is quite simply this: on whom should we show compassion? On whom should we show compassion? If there's going to be winners and losers, the notion of showing compassion is ultimately so that they may win and not lose. But who are we going to show compassion to? The answer, of course, is located in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, verse 25 to 37. And in that parable, it starts off where Jesus is in conversation with a teacher of the law. And the teacher then asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbour? Who is my neighbour?" Now, by the end of the parable, Jesus has then turned that question on its head. And Jesus then asks in verse 36, "Who can you be a neighbour to?" So the question of the Good Samaritan parable isn't who is worthy of my compassion. The question of the story of the Good Samaritan is who can you show compassion to? Who can you be a neighbour to? Rather than asking the question, who is my neighbour? Now, arguably, we might say that the introduction of economic tariffs forces us to choose who we're going to be a neighbour to. Because we might say, okay, well, there's going to be winners and losers. And by introducing tariffs, I'm going to decide who the winners are and who the losers are. I'm going to choose who my economic policy is going to be compassionate towards. And so, in conclusion, I would say then, are tariffs biblical? Well, it's a really, really complex question, and there's no easy answer to it whatsoever. If you think that culture is predominantly local and protecting and enhancing the culture of society, as God first commanded us to do back in Genesis 1 through arts and production and technology, if you think that is predominantly local, and if you think that caring for your neighbour is predominantly a local thing, i.e. people who are geographically close to you and supporting them and supporting their businesses, then I would say you've got a really good argument for using economic and trade tariffs. If, however, you think that all cultures are interdependent, and actually, we are in a state in the world today whereby we rely on goods and arts and music and technology from the US and India and China and South Africa and Mexico and Canada and France and Germany, and it's all interconnected. If you see culture like that, and actually God's command to protect and build and strengthen culture is a global one, then and if you think that everybody, you need to be a neighbour to everyone, not just people who live down the street, not just people in your own industry, then you've got a really hard time justifying trade tariffs, because it flies in the face of that. So where do you sit on it? Do you see culture as local? Do you see that your neighbour is first and foremost the person in your community? Or do you see culture as interconnected and global, and that you need to show compassion on everyone? Let me know in the comments, and theologically, then that should impact the extent to which you think trade tariffs are a biblical or justifiably Christian action or not. And then finally, we are left with the question, of course, are tariffs the best way to deal with this issue? Are there any other alternatives that can be taken where there aren't losers? There's winners and losers when it comes to trade tariffs. Are there other approaches we can have to the economy and to strengthening our own societies that reduce the amount of losers, or perhaps eradicates that altogether, and it's a win-win situation? Do you think there are? Do you think there's other options that as Christians that we can pursue whereby everybody wins? Or are we inevitably having to choose a situation where there are winners and losers? So yeah, it seems to me there are economic arguments in favour and against. But as Christians, we want a good theological understanding of whether President Trump's trade tariffs are biblical, whether they are justified or not. So I hope that coming at it through culture and compassion has given you a theological framework to explore that issue for yourself. Let me know in the comments what you think, and let's have this conversation together. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for being with me today. Sorry my voice is a bit croaky. Hopefully by tomorrow I'll be on the mend again. And I look forward to being with you again soon. Take care. Bye.